The Bride of Frankenstein.
Bride of Frankenstein is a Gothic achievement that may have very little to do with the book written by Mary Shelley, but has instead transcended the source material and has become something greater. With its bold cinematography and expressionistic art direction, the film at times provokes fear, disgust, and heartbreaking emotion. It has the feel of a poetic theatre play, with great sets of makeup that pulls in the viewer in such a way that you never want to leave this bizarre world of dark shadows and even darker villains. The film works perfectly well on its own terms, as a sequel to Wales' Frankenstein, recasting the monster as an outcast, yearning for friendship. Karloff discovers new heights of pathos and rage, again investing the monster with a remarkable degree of humanity. Elsa Lanchester handles two assignments, being first in the preamble as author Mary Shelley, and then the created woman. In later assignment, she impresses quite highly, despite the fact that the bride has very little screen time. Her sharp bird-like movements and angry swan-like hisses, along with Jack Pierce's magnificent makeup and iconic hairdo, have made this character more memorable than the countless monsters that followed. It's hard to fathom that at one point in time, a sequel to a successful feature film was not a foregone conclusion. These days, anything that remotely resonates nostalgia will be granted an unnecessary sequel. Yet long before it was fashionable, Universal Pictures set in motion this concept with their series of Gothic horror movies and created what today we would call a cinematic universe. But what makes Bride of Frankenstein such an intriguing paradox is that the film is often cited as being superior to its predecessor. In 1931, when Wales' Frankenstein was breaking all kinds of box office records and establishing Universal Studios as a major force, the format for success was not so clearly outlined. The studio was somewhat unsure how this softly spoken British director had made such an incredible groundbreaking horror film in the first place. And since Wales himself was on a gargantuan roll following his hit with The Invisible Man and The Old Dark House, the studio essentially granted him free rein for the sequel. The production overall feels greater here. Wales is set loose to make the kind of film he wants. Karloff improves on the monster and conveys the being's suffering without the limitations set over the character in the first film. He learns some English from the hermit, which allows him sparse bits of dialogue. I find the angst of the monster to be quite compelling. At one point, he's able to verbally express that death was a comfort and that Henry bringing him back enraged him. The idea of a mate like him is the only thing that makes this continued, deranged existence even possibly tolerable. Everyone involved seems to have taken what worked on the original and made it a level above here. Bride not only outstrips his original foray into horror in terms of invention and visual splendour, but stands as one of the most beguiling American films ever made.
Our mad dream is only half realized. Alone you have created a man. Now together we will create his mate.
Believing the monster he created to be dead at last, believing himself cursed for delving into the mysteries of life, Dr. Henry Frankenstein swears to never again dabble in the reanimation of dead tissue. But fellow mad scientist Dr. Pretorius has other plans and twists Frankenstein's arm quite forcibly to gain his cooperation in the most unwholesome experiment. The monster is very much alive as it turns out. Hunted, lonely, fearing for his life, he is taken to the woods to escape humanity, and yet his own human heart yearns for companionship, and therein lies Pretorius' unnatural plan to build the monster a mate. Where the original film followed the basic structure of a man defying God, with his hubris leading to disaster, the sequel is a more complex entity, and both Henry Frankenstein and the monster are fleshed to a surprising degree, which is not the case for most sequels. It's fascinating that the original revolved around the Doctor, and the monster was a secondary character. Now things are reversed, and it's Dr. Henry Frankenstein who is sidelined, and the monster that essentially inherits the whole picture. He may not seem like an engaging enough character to hold an entire film, but the writers handle him well. For instance, the monster has an intellect and even speaks this time. While the creature does murder again, the film manages to inject some sympathy for the beast on more than one occasion. One particular scene involves a girl who falls into a lake and begins to drown. To make up for the drowning of the little girl in the first feature, the monster willingly leaps into the lake and rescues her. What makes the plot more intriguing is that Henry Frankenstein isn't the villainous mad scientist he once was before. His portrayal here is somewhat enigmatic but surreal. He is in turmoil after having created what most of the villagers see as a complete, murderous creature. It is the character of Dr. Pretorius, Frankenstein's former mentor, who becomes the film's chief villain, with the monster either somewhere running amok in the village or later being used as a stick to get Frankenstein to go forward with their experiments. His performance is one of the key reasons this film is so remembered. The dry humour of Pretorius is most welcome, which incidentally hides his devious malevolence. He is deceitful beyond all doubt, and paradoxically does not value precisely what he has intention to create. Compare it to Frankenstein's manic joy and despair when he created his own monster in the first film. Frankenstein feels the consequences of his actions, Dr. Pretorius does not. Even Frankenstein finds Pretorius to be a bit extreme, stating that his work is nothing like his own. He has dabbled with the power of life in his own twisted way, and now wants to use Frankenstein's talents to build a female equivalent to the monster. Frankenstein, for his part, wants nothing to do with it, but Pretorius coerces him into it, and the plot proceeds from there. The film is stocked with similarly arresting moments. The monster, pursued through the forest, finding shelter in the house of a blind, violin-playing hermit, himself is lonely as the misbegotten creature, and the tone of the picture takes a dramatic shift. Now in the previous film, the monster was an inarticulate creature that blindly struck out at any perceived threat, but for the sequel, much to the consternation of actor Boris Karloff, who thought the monster should remain mute, we get a wonderful scene between the creature and this hermit that shows them as two forgotten souls, simply searching for friendship in a world that has no place for either of them. This empathetic moment is crucial in the development of the monster, as it is the tearing apart of this brief friendship that is the catalyst for the remainder of the film, because if he hadn't had this fleeting moment of solace, then he would never have fallen under the influence of Pretorius. Bride does have a peculiar opening sequence, as we are quickly introduced to Percy Shelley and Lord Byron on a stormy night, where we find them praising Mary Shelley for her story of Frankenstein and his monster. There is an irony showing the character of Mary Shelley, because our thoughts of Frankenstein owe more to James Wales and Universal Studios than they do Shelley. Additionally, this entry isn't exactly given much closure. It's the first and final time we see these characters. We would expect some kind of epilogue from Shelley about the harrowing ordeal that transpired. Yet this entry is Mary Shelley simply regaling us with further installments of Frankenstein's adventures, stating that
it's a perfect night for mystery and horror. The air itself is filled with monsters.
I'm not entirely sure, but it's probable Wales included Shelley as a professional courtesy, so to speak, being that the magnitude of success the Frankenstein source material had garnered him. I still find his structural conceit to be a tad bizarre, simply for the fact that we have a sequel that opens with characters stating that what we witnessed in the previous film was a fictional story. Does this diminish the weight of the previous story? Perhaps a more appropriate alternative could have involved the prelude of Lanchester's bride before becoming the bride, something suggestive of an illness that would eventually lead to a most untimely death, instead of the ambivalent notion we attain in the film's proceedings. Perhaps this was Wales' way of showing that even sweet Mary harboured a monster within. Bride of Frankenstein is often cited as Wales' masterpiece. While this is nominally a horror feature, the film ultimately presents itself as an inevitable tragedy. As Henry Frankenstein is pulled from the wreckage of the burnt-out windmill, so too does his monster survive, as the latter wanders the countryside in search of companionship and peace from persecution. The former finds himself forced by the insidious Dr. Pretorius to continue his experiments into creating life from dead bodies. Pretorius himself acts as a personification of temptation for Frankenstein, to leave his new bride and continue his work among the dead. Pretorius forces him back, ultimately relying on taking a hostage to force his hand. In an unexpected dual narrative that only winds itself together during the final act, the climax comes in Pretorius' Gothic tower with the bizarre apparatus that uses lightning to animate the cobbled together body parts of the bride. The scene makes such an unforgettable impression that it's easy to forget how little of the picture the bride actually appears in.
Look, the storm is coming up over the mountains. It will be here soon.
The titular bride's appearance is remarkably brief and is presented in an unexpectedly tragic fashion. Elsa Lanchester looks striking in the role, her darting angular movements, reminiscent of the automaton Maria in Fritz Lang's Metropolis, are beautifully controlled, and in contrast to Karloff's hulking gait, strangely elegant. Her appearance, deathly pallid skin with streaks of white hair, highlighting her mountainous bouffant, is another triumph for makeup artist Jack Pierce, and an image as instantly recognisable as Karloff's monster. Whale and Thesiger designed the makeup concept, basing the idea upon the famed sculpture of Egyptian queen Nefertiti, with long hair streaming upward. Bride initially seems beautiful, but her eccentric animation, stitched together neck, uncouth screams, and swan-like hisses quickly dispel this impression. They have transformed. The creation itself carries with it an ethereal weight. We are entirely transfixed, mesmerized by the unnatural. The sense emerges that the implications for creating such a being are now dangerously uncertain. In a most shocking revelation, the woman is finally evolved, but she's just as horrified at the monster as everyone else. The shriek of horror she emits on seeing her intended for the first time rivals Fay Wray's piercing response to King Kong as the most famous scream in cinema history.
She hates me, like others.
She's seeing all this for the first time. She has no memory of who she once was, who Frankenstein and Pretorius are, and what exactly the monster is. So of course she's going to act like a frightened child to what she is witnessing. This moment raises intriguing and perhaps disturbing questions on the intention of creating another being solely for the purpose of marriage. The bride has essentially been rushed into an existence of expected, expedient maturity, far unlike that of a newborn child. There is a sense of involuntary burden here. You can imagine she is flooded with immense, ceaseless emotion and new, overbearing sensations. That is it a wonder in her frightened delirium that she naturally refuses him? And what are the consequences for this rejection? The monster is under the assumption that the only person who will accept him in this world is someone equally as visually ostracizing as him. The bride pulls away in disgust and seeks shelter behind her creator Frankenstein. The monster refuses to stand back, proceeds to sit next to her. He takes her mummified hand in his own and caresses it, causing her more horrified distaste and another shriek. Frankenstein pulls away from her monstrous, abominable counterpart. The monster is hurt and then angry, declaring with a feeling of worthlessness,
She hates me, like others.
With a broken, humiliated, and rejected heart, the monster goes berserk, realizing the utter hopelessness of his life, and determined to destroy everything around him in a rage, he threatens to pull a lever that will destroy the tower and everything in it. This hideous moment of loathsome self-pity has the monster abandoned his conscience. Ironically, you would figure most sympathetic to the bride's reanimated ordeal is in fact cruelest when things do not go his way. Elizabeth escapes from her bonds and races to the tower door, where she pleads for Henry to flee. Henry is given a choice, dramatically positioned between life and death. The monster surprisingly, and perhaps redemptive, spares Henry and Elizabeth by permitting them to rush to safety outside. However, he pronounces judgment upon Pretorius' perversity.
You stay. We belong dead.
As the monster reaches for and pulls the fateful lever to bring both creature and creator to extinction, the bride expels one long, snake-like hiss at him. A tear rolls down the monster's repulsive face. Explosions begin to rock the stone tower. Rubble from the crumbling foundation buries everyone inside alive. With just one act, the monster frees himself because he can no longer bear his sadness. Perhaps he frees his bride because he would rather save her from suffering than keep her as his property. On a nearby hill, Elizabeth and Henry, who has renounced his mad career once and for all, happily embrace as he offers comforting words to her. Darling, darling. Bride of Frankenstein is perhaps the greatest of all Frankenstein films, an absolutely unforgettable macabre piece with painterly and dramatic lighting, beautiful dissolves and tracking shots, sophisticated effects, and unexpected eccentricities. James Whale directed his last horror feature with wit, style, and a grand sense of graveyard humour that elevates it high above most of the other Universal monster pictures of the era. Karloff manages to invest a character with some subtleties of emotion that are surprisingly real and touching. It makes the monster a pitiable creature, one children and adults will have no trouble emphasising with, raising the bar for actors who portray beasts. One of those extraordinary films that transcends genre and period to provide fresh, untold pleasures. It continues with the Gothic tone of the original, but this film includes so much more. Bride of Frankenstein will forever be known as one of the greatest sequels of all time and one of the finest horror features ever made.